Gracias, profesor.
Thank you very much. I give now the floor to Dr. White, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to take a slightly different angle on this, although I think there are some points of continuity with what Richard has been saying. When we talk about European citizenship, we often think of it in terms of building a sense of unity, a sense of oneness. We've heard already today ideas of common values. Sometimes we also hear ideas of a common culture, of a European identity. Maybe another way to approach European citizenship is quite different, but to think in terms of conflict and the place of conflict in European citizenship. Of course, the idea that conflict might be a source of citizenship, of social integration, is quite an old one in social theory, goes well back at least to Georg Simmel, and I believe also has classical antecedents. Sounds, of course, slightly counterintuitive at first hearing, that one might, through conflict, achieve some type of meaningful citizenship, meaningful integration of citizens into a political community. I think such a view would have sounded particularly odd for much of the last 25 years or so. There was, of course, a consensus of sorts in the 1990s, early 2000s, that political conflict was not something to look for amongst contemporary European populations, and that meaningful divisions of opinion were perhaps also hard to find. Many people talked about end of ideology, ideological convergence, post-ideology, a whole different set of ways of phrasing this. And of course, even today, there would be many who would say that essentially amongst the populations of Europe, there are not particularly strong, meaningful differences of opinion, that perhaps political apathy is the best way to diagnose contemporary European citizens, or if not apathy, then some rather bland rejectionism, ideas of anti-politics, or in the European case, Euroscepticism. So the politics of no, I suppose, or the politics of disinterest. I think that view needs to be challenged, not least in light of the events of the last 6-7 years or so. I think as one looks at the Europe of the Euro crisis and beyond, it is possible to talk about meaningful divisions of opinion amongst the populations of Europe, and importantly, one doesn't necessarily have to map those onto territorial divisions between countries, although perhaps tragically sometimes divisions of principle end up taking territorial form. How might one think about some of those divisions of opinion? Well, I think one straightforward way to pose this question would be to think in terms of the diagnoses given of the economic crisis itself, the way it is seen. And I think here one might make a straightforward distinction, but I think one that has continuity with some classical distinctions, left-right distinctions in politics. A distinction between an understanding of economic crisis as a problem of transgression. In other words, individuals, particular actors doing something wrong, whether that's wrong in the sense of an offence to morality, so welfare dependents, lazy southerners, greedy bankers and so on, or whether it's an offence to common sense, irrationality. But I think there's a body of views on the economic crisis that can be understood as accounts based on transgression. And conversely, there's a a different set of accounts where maybe the key word would be adhesion. In other words, that what caused the economic crisis in Europe and beyond is not individuals, groups transgressing what was otherwise an acceptable template, but that the template itself was the problem. Adhesion to either a set of doctrines, faulty economic doctrines, we hear the word neoliberalism, of course, in this sense, or faulty economic structures, maybe a broad economic system itself. And I think one can, with this dualism, read meaningful divisions of opinion and identify them in a number of contemporary European contexts, perhaps most obviously the European parliamentary elections of earlier this year. And so, although often in public discourse we hear categories used that underplay these distinctions, categories like populism, categories like extremism, which elide differences of this kind. Nonetheless, I think it's with categories like this that one identifies the distinction, for example, between UKIP in Britain and Syriza in Greece, for example. These are accounts based on the one hand, transgression versus accounts based, on the other hand, on some notion of adhesion to problematic doctrines and practices. So, this much to say that, however odd it might have sounded a few years ago to talk about the place of political division in citizenship, I think it seems a little bit less odd today if we accept that there are meaningful divisions of principle out there in the populations of contemporary Europe and sufficient to mobilize at least some members of those populations. Of course, there's a sense in which those differences of principle are weakly articulated in a lot of political contexts in Europe. It's easy to point the finger at the EU institutions themselves in this respect. The language of institutions like the European Central Bank is, of course, not the language of divisions of principle of the kind that I've talked about, but often the language of rational calculation, what needs to be done, not what should be done, what different values one might appeal to in opposition to the value commitments of others, but the logic of economic necessity as a way of justifying public policies. But of course, this is not just a problem of European institutions, and I think it would be unfair to direct attention simply to such institutions. This is a problem also, I think, of national politics in many European countries at present, that while there are meaningful differences of opinion to be identified amongst political movements, some political parties at the margins of these countries, the political centre, as we might call it, the politically dominant parties at this particular moment, are often not those that one can identify these divisions of principle in the language of. This is a problem, I think, because when divisions of principle cannot be articulated as such, they may easily take territorial form. If we think of the Scottish referendum just a few months ago, one way, of course, perhaps the default way to see this referendum was as an expression of nationalist feeling. And of course, the Scottish National Party is committed to independence as a goal in itself, a goal of intrinsic worth. But I think it's important to notice that much of the popular engagement with this referendum accelerated when it took on the character of a referendum on the austerity policies of the United Kingdom as a whole. And you might say that the referendum became the outlet for views which perhaps don't have a huge amount to do with nationalism as such. The national arena, the Scottish arena, was the place in which they could find expression given the referendum of the day, but it was not necessarily that these were nationalist views. They were differences of principle concerning the origins and the effects of the economic crisis taking territorial form, and arguably taking territorial form because they struggled to be articulated at Westminster itself. In other words, in the party system of the United Kingdom as a whole. And one can say much more about the condition of the British Labour Party in this respect. Well, I think something similar might be said of the European Union as a whole and citizenship within it, that although there are meaningful differences of opinion, most visible in the context of the economic crisis out there amongst the populations of Europe, they struggle to find meaningful expression in many of the political arenas of the European Union. And when that happens, they are liable to take territorial form and therefore north-south divides, Greece versus Germany, calls for the exit of a member state from the Union, and so on. So let me wrap up. First of all, when thinking about European citizenship, I don't think we necessarily need to use the language of European identity, of unity in a set of attributes or a set of value commitments. There is a classical tradition in social theory for thinking about citizenship and also social integration more generally, not in terms of unity, but in terms of conflict and how it forms ties between those, on the one hand, faced with what they consider to be common adversaries on the other. We should be wary then of diagnosing the problem of European citizenship as the problem of apathy, of the problem of Euroscepticism, understood simply as the rejectionism of Europe as a territorial framework. One should look for ways in which the emergent differences of political opinion can find expression within the institutions of the European Union. Of course, the Parliament is perhaps the place one might look foremost for that, but not only. It's something which is a challenge for the institutions of the European Union more generally. And one needs to do this not least because the politics of necessity, of the necessary adjustments to economic crisis that tends to dominate the technocratic mode of justifying policy making is one that's corrosive to European citizenship. It's one that I would say tends towards a certain fatalism amongst European citizens about what can be achieved politically. The rise of the types of movement of political principle, some of them desirable, some of them wholly undesirable, that I mentioned earlier, I think has to be understood as a reaction against the rather colourless politics of rational calculus and so on, as I've described it, and should be seen as either a warning or at least perhaps even something to embrace as an alternative to that. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you.